Welcome back to the History of the ATF trilogy. And this is episode 4 of the trilogy. Even though we're only doing an overview and we're barely scratching the surface of just a few incidents, this is still taking a lot longer than I planned. However, I do think that this is important stuff to understand today. Judging from the comments on the previous 3 episodes, there are a lot of young people who are learning this stuff for the first time. So let's get into it. Let's have a quick recap. In episode 1, we talked about prohibition as a failed experiment, a catastrophic failure on a number of levels, 14 years of very destructive failure that was overturned by the people. Did the proponents of big government learn from this failure? No. The 1934 NFA was enacted the very next year, and it has nothing to do with alcohol, but it was based on the exact same idea that social problems are solved by government action. And the strategy was the same: remove the rights of many law-abiding citizens to address the actions of a few criminals. Then, in episode 2, we talked about the results of that, the ATF's pivot from alcohol to firearms as their new primary focus. The 1968 Gun Control Act was even worse than the NFA, and the ATF's behavior in the 70s was also worse. It was so bad that there was a major legislative investigation, and protections for firearm owners was passed in the 80s. Did the ATF learn from this correction and change course? No. In the 90s, they executed horrific raids on the private homes of many people over minor and unproven firearm allegations that led to the deaths of innocent men, women, and children. And these were not just accidental bad shoots that happened in the heat of the moment. They were long investigations and brutal sieges with media attention and press conferences and statements from the White House and bystanders and neighbors of the victims begging for the feds to stand down and let the people out. In Waco, the FBI engaged in almost 2 months of inhuman psychological warfare. They smashed private property with military tanks, and then they hit a crowd of trapped families with lethal amounts of flammable CS gas and pyrotechnic grenades. When the smoke cleared and they had finished recovering the bodies of the children, did the government agents learn from this mistake? No, because we were assured that they hadn't made any mistakes. In episode 3, we covered the investigation where Congress demanded an explanation of how this could have happened, and we covered the cover-up where bureaucrats and agents from these departments lied. Not only was there a lack of humility and remorse from Janet Reno and others, but they blew off any attempts that Congress made to hold them accountable. And to make matters worse, the very next year, the Clinton administration pushed through the assault weapons ban, a new gun control act that was just as arbitrary and misguided as the 1934 NFA, and just as empowering for the ATF as the 1968 Gun Control Act. Now, when all this happened, I was pretty young, and as I mentioned in episode 2, my dad and I traveled to Waco right after the compound fell, right after they bulldozed the evidence. Mostly what we did was interview the survivors, and hearing firsthand about the horror perpetrated at Waco was very troubling for me. But what was also troubling was that at the exact same time, our favorite neighbor worked for the ATF. She was not a field agent. She was in the paperwork division, and she was one of the nicest people that you could possibly imagine. It was very hard for me to reconcile the fact that one of the nicest people that I knew worked for the agency that had just wiped a Texas community of small religious families right off the map. How is it that an agency that was capable of such incredible violence against those people that it was supposed to preserve and protect could also be filled with really kind people? Well, if you've watched the previous few episodes, I think you know what I'm going to say. The issues are the foundations upon which this agency is built and the flawed laws that they try to enforce. The laws are so bad in form, and I would say so unconstitutional in spirit, that they drive their enforcers to do terrible things. But more than that, the assumptions of the agency, that it is the government's job to fix all these little social issues, to babysit the citizenry, to preemptively remove possible threats, these will drive people to assume that doing terrible things is necessary. But there was also another enabling factor at the time: massive ignorance. Believe it or not, despite working for the ATF, our friendliest, nicest neighbor was incredibly uninformed about a lot of the things that were going on. There was just a serious lack of communication between different divisions or departments of the Bureau, and most of what she knew about that situation down in Waco was exactly what she saw on the evening news. And, as we talked about also in the last episode, the mainstream media was very well and truly on the side of the Clinton administration and the ATF. Not only did they demonize the Branch Davidians way before the siege, but they also had high praise for the heroes who were down there in the tanks, keeping the rest of us safe. But you should also remember that the reporters, they were incredibly ignorant too, even about what was going on right in front of them. The FBI cut off the Branch Davidians' access to the outside world, so they could not tell the journalists what was going on. Then they pushed the journalists miles away from the compound for their own protection, and so that they couldn't see what was going on. So the media, generally speaking, was speaking largely out of total lack of data. In fact, this entire period can best be marked by a really high level of multifaceted ignorance across almost all parties. And it's so widely spread that I don't even know really where to start. I suppose the first we should begin where a lot of this stuff starts in Waco, the institutional ignorance of the Justice Department. And you can see this most clearly in the way that they originally built their case against David Koresh. The lead ATF agent on the David Koresh case was Davey Aguilera, and he compiled the affidavits to get the search warrant and arrest warrant. And almost everything in this process is a problem. Now, not everything is based on ignorance. Some of it is obviously just bad faith stuff, issues that he knew were irrelevant to his jurisdiction, like the child abuse allegations. He made those very front and center, but he deliberately neglected to mention that that investigation had already been closed by CPS and then later by the FBI because of lack of evidence. He left that part out. Then he developed witnesses and informants who already had a bone to pick with the Branch Davidians, or David Koresh specifically. And in some cases, these were people who were legally blind, which I think kind of impacts the witness testimony a tad. And he compiled tons of stuff that would just never, ever be admitted in court, like secondhand and third-hand hearsay about machine guns from people who were entirely ignorant about firearms. But Agent Aguilera is also ignorant about firearms. The main, real, actual ATF business that would justify the raid is a claim that the Branch Davidians are making fully automatic firearms, and he alleges this based somewhat on third-party hearsay, but mostly on the purchase of the EZ M16 conversion kit. However, there is no such thing. The Branch Davidians were buying the E2 spare parts kit, and Aguilera got the name wrong. Now, it seems like this is kind of an easy mistake to make, but remember, it is being used to allege some serious crimes. He's also not very well versed in firearm law. If you know anything about legal code and how it works, you know that some sections define crimes and penalties. Other sections define other things. Aguilera's request for an arrest warrant states that David Koresh has violated a U.S. code section that merely defines what a destructive device is. It's not a section that has any prohibitions around them. And then there's other stuff which is also not a crime. So when the ATF sent an undercover agent into the compound to talk to David Koresh, Robert Rodriguez, not the one that you think about, not acclaimed director of Spy Kids 3, but a different Robert Rodriguez, he was shown a documentary made by the Gun Owners of America, which, and I quote, portrayed the ATF as an agency who violated the rights of gun owners by threats and lies, unquote. And obviously the ATF took that personally, even though they had been threatening Randy Weaver with threats and lies just a year earlier, they saw this video as a big problem. And so in the search warrant request, they said they needed to look for other audio or video tapes critical of firearms law enforcement or the ATF. They considered this material to be, quote, evidence of the cult member's motive for wanting to shoot and kill ATF agents. All the reasoning and allegations and accusations are just errors and lies and irrelevant nonsense. And this could have been fact-checked or even maybe just questioned by anybody with a little bit of firearm knowledge. But ignorance prevailed. The federal magistrate issued the search and arrest warrants despite all of these issues because, well, I mean, after all, the allegations were big enough. So, needs to happen. Now, like I said, we're barely scratching the surface of the issues with this warrant process. If you want to know more, you need to read the first chapter of No More Wacos because it goes into this in a lot more detail. The first chapter is also on David Kopel's website, so I will link to it below. But as bad as all that intel was, remember that Agent Aguilera is theoretically a professional firearms expert, and journalists of this era are even worse. As we talked about in the last episode, the mainstream media was considerably more powerful than it is today. Alternative media outlets were tiny with very limited reach, and some of this was cultural, but a lot of this, interestingly enough, was just technological. There were only 3 real television networks at the time. Satellite TV and cable were just getting started. There were local papers, but most of them were owned by the big publishing houses and aligned with the mainstream political interests. I mentioned Soldier of Fortune magazine is doing a fantastic job of reporting on Waco and Ruby Ridge, but this was a pretty small magazine with very minimal reach. And if you wanted to say, hypothetically, make a video documentary about the Clintons or the Waco disaster back then, you had a very complex process that included, 1, shooting all of your footage on an analog tube potato camera, which is about as big as a Honda mini bike, then edit that footage in a linear fashion, 1 clip at a time on expensive Betacam decks, then send the master to a duplication house where it can be put onto VHS tape, and then sell those VHS tapes through a toll-free call center where actual phone operators collect credit cards, and then advertise that 1-800 number on the only platform that will even talk to you, which is AM radio. Then you have your call center shut down by the Rose law firm, and then you get randomly audited by the IRS. That is how video production worked in the 1990s. Today, we talk a lot about online censorship and how the algorithms of social media platforms pretty much show people only what they already want to see or what is already in line with their past interests. You know, left-wing folks will only be shown left-wing content and vice versa. But 30 years ago, I think it was actually worse, and it could be hard for right-wing folks to find right-wing content at all, particularly material related to guns. And the events of 1995 made it worse. The Oklahoma City bombing was the final nail in the coffin of the Waco investigations, partly because of destruction of evidence. That was where, a lot of the surviving evidence was stored. Partly because the death toll was twice Ruby Ridge and Waco combined, thus overshadowing all government wrongdoing. But mostly because it proved that the imaginary boogeyman was real after all, that homegrown patriotic American domestic terrorist, and others unknown, was actually coming for us all. Now, I know that we foreshadowed the Oklahoma City bombing pretty strong in the last episode, but we don't really have time to get into it too much here. There's just so much going on, and I think you guys should do a little digging of your own. I think you should check into how many different businesses had offices in the Alfred P. Murrah building, besides the ATF office, of course. And you should find out how many ATF agents were killed in that attack, even though they had an office there. And you should look into what the first responders said, and you should look into what the FBI said. The FBI ran the investigation, just like it kind of always does, and there are some interesting discrepancies, like a manhunt for John Doe 2, a guy that witnesses said that they saw in the truck. And then the FBI claimed that they had found him, and then they claimed that there never was a John Doe 2. So, despite all of these changing stories and craters and truck axles and the very long delay in actually bringing the accused bombers to trial, some things happen really fast, like the remains of the building being demolished ahead of schedule. Congress suddenly had a bunch of domestic terrorism bills in committee very fast. And various talking heads in the Clinton administration already made statements pinning all the blame on right-wingers, particularly some of those conservative talk radio folks on the AM channels and militia groups. They had these people blamed almost before the dust had settled. Every gun owner who was halfway serious about firearms or cared about the Second Amendment was painted with the exact same broad brush. Militia became a dirty word, which still kind of is even to this day. The AR-15 and other modern weapon platforms were banned by the assault weapons ban, and we had to go back to Mini-14s and SKSs, which are equally deadly, but technically inferior. ATF agents descended on gun shows to find anyone who might be selling pre-ban mags. And this is when the NRA and some of the weaker gun rights groups retreated into the safer territory of only discussing hunting and sporting arms. Gun Owners of America held the line, but they were just not cool to be associated with anymore because David Koresh had one of their tapes. By the way, my dad made videos for Gun Owners of America, not the one that Koresh showed the undercover ATF guys, but some others. And the general attitude of this time had a very strong, chilling effect. Even though tens of millions of Americans owned guns, possibly even more than 50% of all households, this constant negative coverage left a lot of people very disquieted. And the gun owners in our neighborhood got real quiet. People actually involved in the gun industry felt even more under attack, and they were, I would say, extremely demoralized and skittish. The guys running the tables at our gun stores and gun shows were kind of nervous because they had, basically the same amount of hardware as the Branch Davidians. And 1990s gun shows were an awesome place to get alternative media like those Gun Owners of America VHS tapes, or used military history books, or back issues of Soldier of Fortune magazine, or Paladin Press paperbacks. But even that stuff got really sketchy. None of it was illegal, but it could get you in a lot of trouble. And if you think I'm exaggerating, amongst the other justifications for that inflammatory David Koresh warrant were not only the fact that he possessed those Gun Owners of America videotapes, but also the anarchist cookbook, drawings of the original Sten gun, and the clandestine magazine Shotgun News. I'm not kidding about that one. If duck hunters can be accused of subversive activities because of their subscriptions to the clandestine magazine Shotgun News, well, you can see the effect of this ignorance and how it will build more ignorance. There was a chasm between gun owners who knew that the Waco raid was bad and their neighbors who knew nothing about guns that they weren't hearing from NPR. Our neighbor who worked for the ATF was totally in the dark about what her superiors were doing in Texas in 1993. And by 1995, she was also pretty ignorant of which of her neighbors owned guns or liked them or were interested in them. It was no longer a topic of polite or possibly even safe conversation. And so the chasm deepened. Now, at this point, I need to make a correction. In the last episode, I put up a Janet Reno quote, which unfortunately I cannot confirm to be correct. It is a disputed quote, and I can't prove that she said it, so I apologize for that. I should have done more due diligence on that quote. But I will say that the attitude of this quote is correct for the time. It's very interesting. I don't remember America in the 90s being quite as politically polarized as it is today, where there's two sides that disagree about everything. Back then, there was tons of overlap between Republicans and Democrats on a bunch of issues, and yet the issue of firearms was incredibly divisive. But in an almost invisible way, a huge percentage of the country owned personal firearms and found them completely normal. And another huge percentage of the country did not only not own firearms, but they were extremely ignorant about them. And they had no idea how prevalent they were. They had no idea how safe they were. They had no idea how often they were used recreationally or defensively. And a sizable part of 1990s America, like journalists and ATF agents, believed that commonly owned and commonly used firearms were already illegal. Also survival food. Also certain publications. Now, it's not clear to me whether Agent Aguilera actually believed that Shotgun News or the Anarchist Cookbook was illegal to possess, or if he just claimed that in his affidavit, but it kind of doesn't matter. The Anarchist Cookbook is stupid, but not illegal. If the accusation that it is illegal is enough to get people killed, well, then the law is arbitrary, and all this gray area is very bad for freedom. If the Fourth Amendment no longer protects your subscription to a completely legal magazine like Shotgun News, then your First Amendment rights are also being eroded. And if you can't talk about firearms, then you lose your Second Amendment rights as well. However, there was a massive change coming. The internet, like all technologies, is a double-edged sword. It has been used for great evil as well as great good, but it has drastically changed the way that America thinks about guns. Obviously, many people have already pointed out that the internet was a big deal, and it changed a bunch of things. But for firearm content, it was like a dam breaking. Because firearms are such powerful tools for decentralization and personal agency and freedom, gun people were very quick to grasp the freedom offered by the information superhighway, because that's actually what we called the internet back in the 90s. No longer were we limited to photocopied newsletters and bootleg VHS tapes from gun shows. People who knew actual things about firearms started blogs and forums where anonymous folks could educate each other about their weapons knowledge popped up everywhere. Now sure, not all this information was the most accurate or relevant or useful at first, but it was a start, and it was like starting a siphon. The more people talked about this stuff, the more interesting it got, and after a decade or so of just fear and stagnation in this area, interest in firearms, especially practical applications in defense and combat, started snowballing. And at the same time, computers that were more advanced let people play more advanced computer games. We've already talked about that in this video, so I won't get into it here, but an entirely new generation of young Americans who were using relatively realistic firearms in computer games became familiar with them, and then curious about them. And then they were able to find information about those firearms from sources online. This whole area of interest became a lot less mysterious and a lot more approachable and a lot less scary. Also, about this same time, there was some movement in the legal landscape as well. The assault weapons ban expired in 2004, which let people buy AR-15s again. So the guns that were overwhelmingly depicted in movies and video games could actually be purchased and owned again. Standard capacity mags and modern firearm features are way more fun than trying to keep your 1940s milsurp weapons running anyway, and this was the stuff that the next generation wanted to have. And the more gun people talked about guns, the more acceptable it became to talk about guns. Every time we moved the needle, it moved a little bit further. We went from a collection of firearm owners who were actually very nervous about our neighbors knowing that we had a .38 revolver in the closet to firearm enthusiasts who were very happy and very enthusiastically posting pictures of our latest AR-15 purchases on social media. And once people start posting pictures of cool AR-15 builds widely, a whole new topic of conversation and commerce opens back up, and it's just an explosion of firearm interest probably not seen since gunpowder was new. And a really key moment was in 2008. The release of Magpul's DVD series, The Art of the Tactical Carbine. This wasn't some sketchy gun show VHS tape about carrying a revolver. This was two experienced riflemen teaching pretty advanced tactical gunfighting skills with solid rifle builds. And more importantly, it was a massive hit. I cannot overstate how important this is at showing just how much the culture has changed since 1998 and how big of an impact this 3 DVD set had on how people think about firearms. And not just technical knowledge, but practical knowledge and mindset, and even just a visual picture of how that tactical carbine works as a tool. But technical knowledge increased too. A perfect example of this more knowledgeable populace is the sale of suppressors. Obviously, firearm suppressors have always been legal in the United States, but after 1934, they were only legal if you purchased a $200 tax stamp from the ATF. And since 200 of those 1934 dollars would be worth about $4,800 today, the unbelievably high cost of the tax stamp made suppressors incredibly uncommon. But over the years, even as inflation went up, the value of those $200 came down, suppressors did not really become more popular. As materials got better and suppressors got better and they became more common in Europe, where they were unrestricted, sales still didn't really pick up over here. The general gun-owning American civilian had kind of forgotten that this was even an option on the table. But today, there are millions of privately owned suppressors, and they are widely understood and widely used. If you look at this graph of NFA forms, which is not just suppressors, but it's mostly suppressors, and you can see that this is not just a steady increase, this is a curve. Also, we made big strides in the area of legal knowledge, and a lot of that credit should probably go to the Second Amendment Foundation, who began to do serious legal scholarship into principles, precedents, and laws that had been forgotten. Technically, they started this before the 90s, but they did serious research in writing and publishing, and gradually the discourse about the Second Amendment and the purpose that the founders had in mind for an armed populace began to sink into the legal world, and this has had a huge effect. If you remember the early 90s, you would remember that carry permits were rare, and Vermont was the only state with permitless carry. Well, today, 28 states allow permitless carry, and the Supreme Court has ruled that every state must issue carry permits. The expanded freedoms, expanded interest, and expanded information all work together to make an unbelievable shift in American culture. Per capita firearm ownership might be higher now than it has ever been since the 1700s, and I believe that firearm training and firearm understanding might also be at an all-time recent high. My reasoning for this is the firearm accidental death statistics. If you look at this graph, you can see that Americans are being safer with their firearms today than 40 years ago. And this is not a per capita graph. This is number of deaths, which is a third of what it used to be, in a space of time where the American population has gone up and American gun ownership has gone up. So I would estimate that Americans are actually more like 6 times safer with firearms now. Now, obviously, we should look at homicide statistics next, and obviously they're kind of all over the map, but they certainly are not trending up as fast as our increased firearm freedoms and massively expanded firearm ownership. They just don't correlate, let alone causate. So let's recap. Over the last 30 years that we've been discussing in this episode, Americans have gotten more educated on firearms, they're more interested in owning firearms, they're purchasing more firearms, they've established for themselves a greater recognition of firearm freedoms in the law, they're carrying firearms more places, and they're training with firearms more often. And despite some left-leaning commenters claiming that these are somehow new takes on the Second Amendment or in some weird uncharted territory, I think we are only regaining the ground, both legal and practical, that our nation was founded on. We have a history of we the people having the rights and responsibilities of owning our own military arms, doing military training, maintaining martial virtues, and so on. And over the last 30 years or so, there has been a major recovery of these attitudes and capabilities. But now, let's go back to the ATF. In 2002, it was moved from the Treasury Department back to the Department of Justice. This is a post-9/11 attempt to rehab the Bureau's image, a kind of a fresher start. And you might be wondering, as overall firearms knowledge has increased by such massive leaps and bounds, and legal precedents like Heller and Bruin have protected our pre-existing rights more firmly, and more of American citizens have bought guns and gotten a lot safer with them, and, carry permit holders have proven themselves to be the least criminally inclined demographic in the United States. Has the ATF noticed this? Have they raised their game? Have they taken a more constitutionally focused and narrow view of their responsibilities and roles? Well, there are 2 bright spots. In 2012, Alex Bosco developed a stabilizing brace for pistols, and the ATF agreed that this was not a stock. The official opinion letter made that clear, and once the braces hit the market the next year, the ATF issued other letters clarifying their legality. And this had a major effect on gun manufacturers and gun sales, because the NFA's restriction on short-barreled rifles is very constricting. There's a lot of ammunitions and applications that just don't need 16 inches of barrel. So it was great to finally have the extra breathing room to explore these things legally. The second win relates to suppressors. Registering a suppressor requires that $200 tax stamp, but also fingerprinting. And Silencer Co. worked very hard to get the ATF to allow electronic fingerprinting and then build kiosks into gun scores to help with the paperwork filing process. And then last year, the ATF even created an electronic form and started using computers themselves, so the wait time went from over a year to mere weeks, and sometimes less. So is this a kinder, gentler ATF, or just one that is aware of basic technological trends? Well, a good test would be to look at how they do enforcement. Have they prioritized chasing actual criminals and only gone after those people who are posing legitimate lethal threats? Have they stopped killing people who get paperwork wrong? Well, no. We haven't had any Wacos recently, but they are still doing the lethal raids. Last year, ATF agents descended on the house of Brian Malinowski, who was a gun owner and collector. He frequented local gun shows in Arkansas where he'd been under surveillance for months, despite the fact that he was the director of the Bill and Hillary Clinton National Airport in Little Rock, and he could have been approached at any time in that very safe and very gun-free zone. The ATF decided that he was an immediate enough threat that they had to speed to his house for a 6 a.m. battering ram raid. And they were in too much of a hurry to use their body cams, but not in such a hurry that they could not tape over his doorbell camera, so we really have no idea how it was that he got shot dead. Now, at this point, you could be excused for assuming that this guy is an exception because of his close approximation to the Clintons, but I would not make that observation. Not on camera. The fact is, this is still kind of business as usual for the ATF, despite a major sea change in the way that regular Americans look at, think about, own, and use firearms. And this is a problem. Raids like the one in Arkansas would be horrifying on their own, obviously, because it's disproportionate force, terrible strategy, etc. But the worst part of it is that this kind of thing happens in spite of good ATF agents, like my former neighbor. And the worst part is there might even be a lot of good ATF agents. Since I was a little kid looking at the aftermath of Waco, my path has crossed that of the ATF several times. T-Rex Arms is an FFL. We've had agents come through this room several times. There have been regular audits and so on and so forth. But in addition to the official interactions, I've also bumped into a number of ATF agents in different places that I respect in various other ways. And even high-ranking agents have sometimes had really good ideas. Ronald Turk is a great example. He was briefly the second in command at the ATF, and in 2017, he wrote an amazingly open-minded white paper which recommended the modifying and reducing of some ATF regulations. Everything from gun show restrictions, completely removing restrictions on suppressors, and then even, amazingly enough, pointing out that the ATF should notice that AR and AK-style rifles are in common use now, and, I quote, re-examine its almost 20-year-old study to bring it up to date with the sport shooting landscape of today, which is vastly different than what it was in 1989 and 1998, unquote. He said exactly what I would have, almost exactly what I said at the beginning of this video, only perhaps he didn't say it quite as strongly as I would have, because the ATF has a history of retaliation against its own guys. And sure enough, despite being deputy director at the agency, despite only putting these ideas forward for discussion as suggestions, and despite Donald Trump being in office at the time, he didn't stay at the agency much longer. And now we come to another significant beef that I have with the Bureau itself. Some of the people most poorly treated by this particular arm of the DOJ are the ATF agents themselves. There have been a number of investigations, whistleblowers, and anonymous ATF comments on the internet that paint a pretty bleak picture of internal office politics and toxic management. Not only are these agents exposed to these rogue assumptions and required to enforce these terrible laws, and not only are they having to do it in an incredibly tangled modern bureaucracy, but there do appear to be some administrative issues as well. You can read about these on cleanupatf.org. Technically, the forums have been down for a while, but archive.org and other people have backups. The retribution from higher-ups inside the Bureau is very unfortunate and unpleasant to read about, but maybe that doesn't surprise you, given how they treat the rest of us. Now, I should point out that this is not all negative stuff. An investigation in 2024 discovered that the ATF illegally overpaid a few agents by $20 million of hazard pay, but those were the administrative supervisors, so I don't know. And speaking of corruption, there have been some ATF operations that have dodgy financials as well. In 2013, the ATF's undercover tobacco operations got a little bit of attention from the press, and it's kind of a complicated story. Apparently, the ATF set up a massive cigarette selling operation, kind of inside of a legit tobacco business, and then kind of totally took it over. A little bit like when, one mafia family takes over another one's turf. The stated goal was to tackle cigarette smuggling, which, as you know, cuts the US government out of their much-deserved tax money. So the ATF flipped this existing Virginia tobacco company from being a legit business to selling almost exclusively untaxed cigarettes to smugglers. So far, so good. It's probably a kind of a cool way to develop leads, but they just kept selling the cigarettes. ATF agents on paid government time were running a tax-free business selling merchandise that the government had paid for to criminals, and then just kind of keeping the profits. I just want to say here, as a businessman, we should talk about how awesome this setup is, because I think that T-Rex is a pretty successful business, but imagine how much more profitable we would be if we did not have to pay our employees because they were already on payroll to the ATF, and if we didn't have to buy raw materials because we could just commandeer or confiscate them, and then if we had any competition that we couldn't undercut, we would just arrest them and then, provide guaranteed protection to our customers. It's a pretty amazing business model when you think about it, and it would obviously generate a huge amount of cash. But we're not sure exactly how much, and we also don't know where it went. When the Inspector General of the Justice Department looked into it, he found that the ATF had lost $127 million worth of cigarettes in undercover operations, which seems like a lot. I will link to more info in this description down below, because it's a wild story. There's all kinds of twists and turns, and then one of the participants was elected president of Paraguay, so you should look into it. And there are quite a few stories like this in the ATF. They're not all quite this crazy, but I do want to skip to possibly the worst. Technically, this is two separate operations, Operation Wide Receiver and Operation Fast and Furious, but they do the same thing, and they're part of Project Gunwalker, which does exactly what it sounds like: walk guns across the Mexican border directly into the hands of the cartels. The story begins when gun stores in Arizona call the ATF to report potential suspicious buyers. When that happens, they push pause on the sale and they contact law enforcement. But the ATF assured them that it would be safe to go through with the transaction because this was all part of a well-planned operation to address criminal violence in Mexico that was being perpetrated with American firearms. And as we all know, the border is fairly porous, so tightening that up will be a high priority of the United States government at the time. And obviously, the cartels operating south of the border have access to a significant amount of weapons and military hardware, and they're using it to do terrible things. So it makes sense for the Arizona firearm dealers to assume that this is a high priority of the ATF. I mean, it's only at the ATF's explicit directions that they went ahead and sold a number of guns to obviously dodgy people who moved them directly across the border. But then the ATF didn't just allow these sales. They actually placed blocks on the internal tracing for these firearms as a way to ensure that those dealers, and also law enforcement guys, do not get alerted when those firearms are used in crimes. Only the ATF keeps track of this because the entire idea that the operation was going to clamp down on firearm trafficking was a fraud. There was no mechanism for recovering those firearms. There wasn't even any communication with the Mexican authorities to let them know to pick those bad guys up as soon as they got to the other side of the border. In fact, the ATF did not even tell their own Mexico City office that thousands of guns were coming into Mexico under their very noses. And eventually, a number of people questioned this. First, obviously, it was the firearm dealers themselves. As the program went on, it got more and more noticeable that they were letting a lot of guns out of the country. And the agents running the operation assured them that everything was well in hand, that they were generating really good anti-cartel results, and they were making sure that nobody was in danger. But then low-level ATF agents also began to express doubts. And as they visited gun shows and documented the transactions and even followed the purchasers to safe houses and border crossings, they became deeply concerned that only documenting was going on. I highly recommend that you read up on Operation Fast and Furious yourself. I highly recommend this book, I'm From the Government and I Am Here to Kill You, by David T. Hardy, because it goes into a lot of the details and conversation about what happened. The author is a former government lawyer, so he has a pretty good idea of how these sorts of things work behind the scenes. But now, as an author and a writer and a public advocate, I think that he does a really good job at laying out the issues. In a lot of ways, Operation Gunrunner is being run like the Virginia tobacco fiasco. The ATF is assisting in the trafficking of a whole bunch of firearms. And, they do generate a couple of leads, and they even get an extra $49 million budget allocation from Congress to deal with all these firearms crossing the border. However, it seems obvious that they had a deeper ulterior motive than just budget allocations. While Wide Receiver happened at the end of the Bush presidency, Fast and Furious began at the express direction of political appointees of the Obama administration. So, Eric Holder was the Attorney General, and he has ties to some of the players in Arizona. And then anything involving Mexico should probably also have some sort of connection to the Secretary of State, who was, I believe, Hillary Clinton at the time. And then, after the failures of the assault weapons ban and various other gun control arguments, certain people in this administration were looking for specific justifications for increased firearm regulations in America. Unregulated American guns getting into Mexico and causing horrific murders at the hands of the cartels just might do it. And speaking of horrific murders, they did happen. Operation Wide Receiver let 400 guns across the border, and over 10% of them showed up at crime scenes. Eventually, over 2,000 firearms made it direct to the cartels under close ATF watch, where they have been used to cause at least 69 deaths in Mexico and at least 11 deaths in America. Brian Terry, an American Border Protection agent, was killed by one of these weapons, and one of the weapons that was used in the 2015 Paris Bataclan massacre can be traced back to one of these Fast and Furious gun deals. So it's kind of an issue. And obviously the other 2,000 guns are still out there in the hands of, well, mostly it's the Sinaloa cartel. So the body count will continue to rise. And the crazy part is we never would have found out about this if it weren't for the whistleblowers. The ATF were quick to point out whenever a firearm from an American gun dealer showed up at one of these crime scenes, but they never actually figured out how it got there. They never would have admitted to being an accessory to its sale or complicit to it walking across the border. Fortunately, ATF agents came forward and exposed the whole thing. Obviously, there was then a cover-up, just like the cover-up we covered in the last episode in the series. But thanks to these whistleblowers, there was enough documentation that we think that we now know most of the story. And the most important of these whistleblowers was probably Agent John Dodson. Dodson is not only an example of what I believe is a good ATF agent, he is also the poster child for ATF hostility towards its own employees. He had a fantastic track record of law enforcement in other agencies and departments, and was willing to take on some of the riskiest undercover jobs that the ATF has. Sometimes ATF agents have, I would say, easy undercover roles, like running a white supremacist organization, or going to gun shows with Randy Weaver, or just, watching Gun Owners of America documentaries with David Koresh. There's no real danger involved in those. But John Dodson went undercover with the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, and he actually annoyed them to the point that they have tried to kill him and his wife and his children. But despite incredible threats against his life and his family, the ATF will not protect this gentleman anymore. They would rather retaliate against him because John Dodson is a whistleblower, because he testified before Congress about how his superiors lied to gun dealers, lied to other law enforcement agents, and were lying at that time directly to Congress. So they hung him out to dry. No protection for him or his family. And Dodson has explained he blew the lid off this operation because of Brian Terry's death, a loyalty towards a fellow law enforcement officer and a desire for justice. But in the larger collective leadership of the ATF, there can be no loyalty to an individual ATF agent if he's not on board with the larger collective mission of the agency. Which brings me back to a point that I made earlier. If you remember back in the first episode of this series, we talked about Prohibition and that time in the 1920s when the government poisoned hundreds of thousands of barrels of whiskey. Some, not all, but some government agents and the teetotalitarians were very happy with the outcome, which was hundreds or possibly thousands of fatalities, because these were acceptable losses in the war on alcohol. The ends justified the means, even though the ends were supposedly protection from the slow poison of alcohol. The means of fast poisoning were just A-okay. And even though the end goal of the ATF is theoretically to protect American citizens and others from gun violence, the ATF is willing to facilitate massive gun violence against its own citizens to pursue its own larger goal of just compliance with arbitrary gun laws. Now, we have talked in this series about different ways in which the ATF is seen to be a rogue agency. The first is accountability. When it is investigated, it lies. When it is disciplined, the discipline is inevitably reversed. It just will not be held accountable. The other way is this counterproductiveness, to pursue the preservation of life in a way that gets a whole lot of people killed. And then the third way is that it is going in a wildly different direction than we, the people, want it to, because that renaissance of firearms interest that we mentioned earlier in this video has continued to run right up until today. This giant snowball of technically motivated firearm interest is still moving. Firearm content on the internet is just freer. Take a look at the view count on this video. It's probably not great, but as small as this number is, it would have been really, really hard to do these kinds of numbers with a VHS tape. And remember, this is a tiny channel. Even on YouTube, which is technically a hostile environment, we have gun tubers who get millions upon millions of views every single week. We've got massive gun sales in this country that are increasing every year, and the demand drives countless small AR-15 machine shops to build things, which is driven and kind of been driven by a manufacturing boom of cheap CNC machines and powerful CAD tools and decentralized machine shops. The competition in this space is really high, leading to some great refinements in both weapons technology and manufacturing technology, which leads to higher quality and better customer support. And it's interesting to learn more about that stuff, which means that things that have always been legal but kind of rare, like suppressors or making your own guns, this is cool again. 80% lowers in 3D printing. These are real hot areas for experiments and education right now, and I love it. But the ATF doesn't. I think I've made my case that, at least in some ways, the ATF is getting worse, while firearm culture is getting better. The chasm that we had in the 90s is back, and in a lot of ways, it's wider than ever. The federal aggressiveness and recent crackdowns on some of these things is not in spite of a maturing gun industry and greater knowledge and wider ownership and better tech and improved safety. It's actually kind of because of it. There is an attempt to put a lid on what is obviously an unstoppable movement. This becomes even more obvious in 2021. That was when a newly elected President Biden, or possibly somebody in his administration, handed down new executive orders with new directives for the ATF, which resulted in things that made the agency even more aggressive towards small gun companies and small gun dealers and law-abiding gun owners. The first was a new zero-tolerance record policy, which led to the highest rate of revocations of FFLs in ATF history. A perfect example of the confusion in this space is a case that happened, I think it was just this December. The FBI went in and raided a guy named Spafford. The ATF claimed that he had an SBR, and to prove it, he posted a picture. As you can see here, Exhibit 2 shows us the barrel length is indeed less than 16 inches. But you can see the issue here. If he has a brace on that pistol, it's not an SBR at all. So the fact that they're not showing us the only really relevant piece of evidence in their claim is kind of an issue. And it's unclear at this point whether this is a bad faith documentation of something or total ignorance on their part. Perfect example of the kind of thing that needs to be cleaned up at the root. Second is that brace ban. We've talked about short barrel rifles, and we've talked about that stabilizing brace that goes on pistols. The only difference between a rifle and a pistol is now apparently the piece of plastic that you put on it. And the ATF waited until stabilizing braces had been legal and popular on the market for an entire decade before they changed the rule and made it a felony once again. They waited until there were somewhere between 10 and 40 million braces purchased by American citizens before they made it illegal. They also have changed the definitions of frames and receivers to crack down on firearm parts and firearm tinkering. And we've made a video specifically about that as well. And throughout all this, there has been a focused persecution of individual gun manufacturers like Polymer 80, and an effort to shut down some of these things, not just because they represent a danger, usually no danger is obvious, but because they represent a specific passionate interest of we, the people. And there's a level of hypocrisy that comes out as well. Last week, the director of the ATF stepped down. Dettelbach retired ahead of an incoming Trump administration, and as a present, he was given an 80% lower to take home with him.
So this does not need to be traced.
Okay.
Nor registered.
A reminder of the thing that he had tried to destroy but is still 100% legal and apparently a good present to give somebody. There isn't a whole lot of really solid explanation for why some of these things are happening if they aren't political and personal vendettas. And it has demonstrated that the ATF is just more power hungry, constantly bringing down new rules and new regulations, which technically usurp the legislative power of Congress. Here in the United States, we have a separation of powers for a reason. The executive branch is going to do some enforcement, the legislative branch is going to write the laws, and then the judicial branch will make sure that everybody's playing by the rules and kind of works as a tiebreaker. But as executive agencies and departments have taken more and more rule-making and regulation writing control over this process, they're almost writing new laws. And a lot of the ATF rules and regulations are essentially laws with crimes and prohibitions and procedures attached to those. And along with those things comes a huge amount of confusion over what it is that you can actually attach to what kind of rifle. How much work do you have to do to convert something into a firearm before you are committing a crime? And figuring this stuff out, even for the ATF agent who's out there in the field, is technically, I would say, a practically and physically impossible thing to enforce. It ends up creating all of this gray area, which sort of creates a black market and destroys honest politics. And ultimately, as you can see, demonizes the lawful gun makers and lawful gun owners, which brings us right back to where we start. Prohibition did exactly the same thing. You have that exact same physically impossible task, which is constitutionally indefensible and clearly politically motivated. That is, as we reminded you, the foundation of the ATF. And my argument is the ATF is still running on the same rails and still growing out of the same poisonous roots. So now we come to an obvious question. What should happen to the ATF? I think it's obvious that something needs to be done. In the 1990s, the media assumed that the conflict was between a large government agency and a handful of fringe gun nuts out there in Texas and Idaho. But today it's obvious that there's a disagreement between a gigantic and growing part of the population and an increasingly authoritarian and out-of-touch bureau. As the chasm gets wider, the tensions get higher. There is a gathering storm, and something does need to be done soon. It is unfair to both the American people and to the ATF themselves to keep things running on their current track. If you've watched all these videos, by now you're probably just in favor of the ATF just going away, being dissolved, but not so fast, because the last and only time we've ever shut down a government department, it was the Office of Economic Opportunity. It was a scandal-ridden failure of bureaucracy, and when it was dissolved, it just disappeared completely. Just kidding. All of its people and programs got given to other departments, mostly the Department of Health and Human Services. If we axed the ATF right now, that is exactly what would happen. All of its people and assets and regulations and rules and missions and problems would be absorbed by other agencies, and the vast majority would probably go to the FBI. Now, I hope this series has shown you that the FBI is just as prone to overreach and abuse and cover-ups as the ATF. The FBI has collaborated on some of the ATF's worst moments. So killing the ATF name and just letting it live on as part of a bigger and more powerful and better funded FBI is not really the answer. So let's look at the ATF specifically, what it actually has in terms of assets and liabilities. They have the budget and the staff, obviously. They have a giant database of NFA items, which they are allowed to have. And then they have a giant database of regular guns, which technically is illegal. The Firearm Owners Protection Act that we talked about being passed in 1986 actually forbids the creation of a firearm registry. But despite that, the ATF has been compiling digital records of FFL transactions for years, and today they say they have nearly 1 billion records in searchable format. Is that a registry? Maybe. Is it being used to solve crimes as they claim? Maybe. There's a lot of stuff to unwind here. And then there are the regulations and the responsibilities that the ATF has. So let's look at things like FFL oversight. We really want regular people to be able to purchase and own firearms. And right now, that's a very large, convoluted process that requires the ATF. Unwinding that needs to be done somewhat carefully. And then, also under the purview of the ATF are explosives and arson investigations. As a former firefighter, I think these are extremely important. But as the United States has grown as a country, as states have gotten more people and more sophistication, this is something that can be handed down to a local level. But again, it's going to take time and procedure. And then there's the undercover operations. Law enforcement loves undercover operations, and I think they work better in other agencies than the ATF, because with other types of enforcement activities, usually find additional crimes. When the DEA hunts drug traffickers, for example, they usually find human traffickers or criminal networks or money trails that connect to other actual crimes. But when the ATF tracks down a guy who messed up his NFA paperwork and they lift up that dark and sinister rock to look under it, they usually find a totally squeaky clean guy who was going out of his way to get the paperwork and get the fingerprints and get a letter from his local sheriff and buy a tax stamp and wait patiently, and then he will usually politely open his door if you knock on it, instead of hitting it with battering ram. As I mentioned before, the concealed carry permit holders are the most law-abiding section of the citizenry that exists. They are 100 times less likely to commit crimes than even cops. And so, focusing on gun owners, collectors, hobbyists, people who pursue the protection of other people, well, there's no discovery bonus here. There's no reason to treat these cases with the same level of hostile suspicion and aggression of others. And then, there's also usually too much overlap. The FBI does drug investigation at the same time the DEA does. And this infiltrating gangs and conspiracies in multiple different agencies to do is confusing, which is why you end up, with the ATF trying to get Randy Weaver to be an informant on a group that's already being run by undercover dudes from other agencies. At best, this is highly inefficient, and at worst, well, you've seen the worst. Now, David Hardy has a recommendation in the appendix of I'm from the government and I'm here to kill you. It is actually a piece of legislation that he recommends Congress pass called the Federal Accountability in Damages Act. It's only a few pages long, but it would allow the public to do the redress of grievances thing that we're supposed to, and allows people to be made whole after destructive government action. And because the money would come out of departmental budgets, the punishment would actually have some pain associated with it. There's also a number of recommendations in David Koppel and Paul Blackman's book, No More Wacos. It's almost the last half of the book that is a laundry list of recommendations covering everything from those inflammatory affidavits requesting rubber stamp warrants, all the way up to how those bigger federal accountability cases should be done. I think there's a lot of good ideas in here. And as other types of regulation and enforcement and surveillance have expanded, we need more wide-ranging solutions than just looking at one or two bureaus. It's time for some really serious conversations about how we unwind these giant institutions and bring some of the responsibility back to the people. Thank you very much for watching all 4 episodes of this trilogy. At this point, the plan is for this series to be at an end, and for bigger, serious, more conversations about the future of the ATF and the future of American freedom and the legislative process to continue in other places with other people. But there's always the possibility that the ATF will continue to do stuff and we'll get future episodes. So in a lot of ways, the ball's kind of in their court.